With Chatham House punctuality, it is 1 o'clock. My name is Andrés Rosenthal. I'm a senior policy advisor here at Chatham House, and I'm moderating this session today. We have two of our three panelists. The ladies are here. So I'll start by introducing them, and then our third panelist should be here momentarily. So to my immediate left, Kristina Cortez, who is the CEO of Canning House. I think most of you are aware that Canning House is Latin America's presence to a great extent in London. She is a political economist with a lot of international commercial experience in government, finance, and energy. She will be joined by Elena Lazarou, who is a professor at the Fundación Getúlio Vargas, Brazil, currently on leave doing other things here in Europe. The author of a good number of books. Dr. Lazarou specializes on transatlantic relations, global governance, security, and defense issues. And next to her, Rodrigo Aguilera, a London-based economist, Mexican, who used to work here at Chatham House and also at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and is now doing freelance work as a consultant. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the Universidad de las Américas in Puebla, Mexico, and an MSc in Social Policy and Development from the London School of Economics. We will give each of them a 5 to 6 minute presentation slot so that they can talk about the theme that we have for today. I remind you all of three things. One, that this is an on-the-record meeting. Secondly, it's being live streamed on Chatham House's website. And please put your mobiles on mute or turn them off so that we don't have any interruptions. So, Kristina.
Andrés, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. What I want to do is just briefly outline some reflections on how we got to where we are in both Brazil and Mexico in the context of the region. And then I'm going to suggest a few areas where there are potential similarities and differences between López Obrador, AMLO as I shall call him from now on, and Bolsonaro, which will be developed by my colleagues on the panel. So first of all, let's just reflect for a second on how we actually got here and what the recent elections were about. Fundamentally, this was a rejection of the status quo by those who don't feel part of the elite or feel left behind, either because they haven't benefited at all from progress, or alternatively, they did for a while, but then they lost it again because of economic downturns and recessions. And it's also a rejection of the status quo by people, sometimes the same people, who are literally in the firing line of crime and corruption. So although much can be made of the left-right differences between AMLO and Bolsonaro, I would argue that this wasn't actually important to most of the voters. So this is why you had, for example, a substantial number of women and gays voting for Bolsonaro. Fascinating interview that I heard with a gay man from one of the favelas who basically said that, yes, he was worried about being beaten up for being a homosexual, but he was more worried about being killed for his cell phone. It's also why businesses are prepared to give the benefit of the doubt to AMLO. Despite some left-leaning policies, if he manages to curb corruption and crime, they may yet prosper, hence they voted for him. Looking more broadly across the region, I think that Mexico and Brazil in their recent elections are consistent with something of a trend that's going on across the region. I hesitate to say that the region is uniform. It isn't. I mean, Latin America is basically, it's a construct from history. It's really no more homogeneous than Europe, Asia, or Africa, but there are some trends that we can highlight. Voters basically disillusioned with the system's failure to deliver on crime, corruption, and growth. Lashing out, therefore, at their elected representatives whom they regard as distant, unaccountable, self-serving, often corrupt, who've either let them down or in some cases completely ignored them. And so there's been a punishment of the previous governing elite. So in Mexico, the PRI, Peña Nieto, got it in the neck. The PT had that punishment meted out to them in Brazil. Voters have shown themselves willing to discard the old allegiances and support candidates and new parties who have promised them some kind of change. It's actually interesting that both AMLO and Bolsonaro successfully claimed to be mold breakers, despite having been part of the political system for decades. I'd also observed that the traditional two-party systems have been breaking down rather more generally. So in Colombia, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Honduras, and most recently El Salvador, this hasn't always resulted in the rise of new parties, as we've had sometimes in Europe. Sometimes it's just breakaways from the old parties, but there's been quite a fragmentation going on and a regrouping in ways that are not necessarily expected. One of the results of this is you've got, across the board, you've got even fewer, I would say, majorities in Congress. You've got more fragmentation of parties, and this even more requires coalitions and makes really any government platform rather harder to deliver because the coalitions don't necessarily meld in a long-term way. Looking at all the elections that happened in 2018, I would say that there has definitely been a regional shift towards the center-right. Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Argentina so far. But there's also still a significant left-leaning presence in the form of Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and of course, Cuba. I'm not going to dwell on the specific election results. I'm sure my colleagues will go into that in detail. But what was interesting was that despite the ultimately majoritarian results for the candidates who got through, it's interesting to note that their oppositions were flattened. I mean, the PRI in Mexico had its worst results since it was founded in 1929. And Lula's PT is now on a par in Congress with Bolsonaro's new PSL party, both in the lower house and also in the Senate. Not sure how I'm doing on time, Andres. You're going to stop me if I run out of time. But I just want briefly to look at a few ways in which we've got some similarities and differences. Different ends of the political spectrum between AMLO and Bolsonaro, yes, but similar electoral methodology. So populist messages, interacting with the voters via social media over the heads of the traditional parties. Will this direct democracy approach continue? Well, if AMLO's consultations on the Mexico City airport and also the train in the Yucatan Peninsula are anything to go by, it suggests that that's a definite yes. The cabinet compositions, I won't go into detail. Suffice it to say that there's quite a lot of military in the Bolsonaro cabinet. I think that's been well highlighted, and only 2 women, though to be fair, Timea had only 1. No Afro-descendants, no indigenous members. In Mexico, of the cabinet, you've got 7 women, and you've also had an indigenous ceremony, which AMLO went through as part of his inauguration. So there's a very different flavor there. But there are other ways in which they are remarkably similar. Reliance on the military is one. In Bolsonaro's case, it's obvious. He's got them in his cabinet. In AMLO's case, it's perhaps less obvious, but he is going to be heavily dependent on them until he gets his new National Guard up and running. The influence of evangelicals has also been commented on a great deal with Bolsonaro. His slogan for the campaign, Brazil before everything and God above all, is very obvious that there's the influence there. But nevertheless, AMLO also is in coalition with his own party, Morena, a Marxist left-wing party, and also the evangelicals. So they've definitely got an influence going on in there. How am I doing on time, Andres? Tiny bit
2
more?
minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. On the domestic economy, they're coming from very different directions. So, I mean, AMLO's got left-leaning policies, but he has promised that he's going for macro stability. He's also going to respect the independence of the central bank. So it'll be interesting to see quite where that works out. Bolsonaro has got 2 Chicago free traders in his team, but he's also got anti-globalists as well. So again, will they meld or will they fight? What I suggest is that since both need to satisfy the voters by developing or delivering rather growth and infrastructure, the convergent needs of both parties may actually drive convergent behavior. I'm going to stop there because I think we can talk about the regional impact further down the line.
Thank you, Kristina. Thank you very much. Elena.
Thank you very much, Andres. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always very hard to speak about what a government is doing after a month, barely a month and a half after the inauguration of the president. So a lot of what I'm going to say is speculative. What I wanted to do in my 5 minutes is point out a couple of issues that we may be seeing and probably will be seeing in the domestic and the foreign policy sphere. But before doing that, I think it's essential to set out the setting of what we're seeing right now in Brazil, because in many ways it's a bit like a Brazilian telenovela. If you don't know the characters and the background, it's very hard to turn on the TV and understand what's going on. So what I thought I'd do is start with a bit of that. What we have right now is a very popular president. In spite of anything the media might be saying right now in Europe and elsewhere, the fact is that the support for Bolsonaro is right now at 70%. This means that people who did not vote for him currently are optimistic about the way his presidency is going to go. And what is staggering is that the last data we had on Temer was his popularity was 7%. So we went from a president that's 7% popular to someone who is 70% popularity, which means that there is space to do things. I'm not saying whether these things are good or bad, but this is what we have. We also have a relatively strong president, strong in the sense that while his party is very small in Congress, in both houses, and that, as I'll explain in a minute, will be a huge struggle, nevertheless, his supporters, and by this I don't just mean his party, but the other parties that are aligned with him, have won the governorships of 4 of the most important states in Brazil: São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Porto Alegre, and Minas Gerais. He has just been very successful in terms of support from both houses of Congress, because we've had just seen the elections for the speakers of both houses, and both are from the Democrats, which are have given their support to the PSL, so his party. So in general, I would say we have a very strong president. But how did Bolsonaro become a strong president? Because a year ago, this was totally unpredictable, and in fact, all odds were beaten when he won. I'd say many of the reasons you mentioned, mainly 3 issues. Crime is extremely high. We have 64,000 homicides in Brazil per year, based on last year's data. The economy, terrible. Brazil has just come out of recession, but it's still not growing, and no one has forgotten how bad it got during 2014 until a year ago. And corruption. I think these are the 3 issues that basically brought down the establishment. And not to forget that the Lava Jato unraveling of who was involved in these corruption scandals, including prominent members, former presidents from all main establishment parties, basically brought that establishment down. So why did Bolsonaro win? I'd say these are basically the reasons. Many polls have shown that the Lava Jato revelations basically eradicated public support and public confidence in all of the institutions, legislative, executive, and partially the judiciary, because some viewed it as politicized. So what remained essentially was what Bolsonaro brought to the fore. Someone that's not very much linked to any of those, even as in his legislative career, he was not a prominent member of the Congress. He represents the military, which was basically untouched by the scandal, and he brought on board the evangelicals, who were also not affected by the scandal. So basically, Bolsonaro represented everything that had not yet been touched. This is the setting. A very popular president with all the facts I mentioned, but also relatively weak in Congress, and with a very bizarre mix of a team in his cabinet. And I say bizarre because we have people representing different ideological approaches to issues. We have a very powerful economy minister, now also responsible for trade, in the form of Guedes, who you mentioned, the Chicago-trained economist. Very much pro-liberal economic reforms, wants to bring down the fiscal deficit, pro-trade, reduce tariff barriers, and has been given a lot of power since the new economics ministry is a merger of 3 former ministries, which at times was a problem when it came to issues such as trade, because several ministries had to agree. A powerful minister of justice in the form of Sergio Moro, who was the main chief justice responsible for the Lava Jato scandal, so representing some morality when it comes to justice, but interestingly enough now becoming slightly more politicized. An anti-globalist foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, representing a very conservative sort of pro-Christian Western approach to foreign policy, and a military vice president with a very strong opinion, who is very pragmatic about foreign policy.
So this is whom he has fought.
Yes.
Publicly.
At times, yes. Recently, indeed. So it's a very strange mix. One would say that perhaps the reason he has all these people on board is because the base that voted for Bolsonaro itself is a very diverse base representing very diverse interests. And this takes me to the domestic issues, because I think the biggest challenge for Bolsonaro is exactly the diversity of his base. In Congress, it will be practically impossible to use the traditional method of presidential coalition building, of sort of payouts and favors in order to get several parties on board, which is how Brazilian politics usually happens in Congress. And many are suggesting that instead he will go for the caucus method, so interest-based approach to several issues. The three most important caucuses that are in support of Bolsonaro, those who people refer to as bullets, Bible, and beef. So agriculture, law and order, and the evangelicals are set out to be probably his most prominent supporters. But again, to get all these caucuses to support every kind of proposal will be a difficult task. How much time? Finished? Sorry, I underestimated. So as I will say later in the Q&A, the main challenge for this Congress will be pension reform. We'll talk about this later. And there are several interesting foreign policy issues that I look forward to discussing in the Q&A.
Thank you, Elena. I'm sorry that it's short, but I think we want to give as much time to our audience to participate. So, Rodrigo.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here at Chatham House, where I used to work 10 years ago, exactly. It's great to be on this side of the auditorium for once, though. First, I want to start with what the historical significance of AMLO's victory in this previous election is. Mexico had not voted for a left or liberal president since 1910, so that was more than a century of not a single election going to the left. It also hadn't had a leftist government at all from 1982. So basically someone my age, 39 years old, has basically had center-right governments for 36 years over that time, which is quite a lot. And it's telling of how the Mexican political establishment really is a tough nut to crack. So why did a leftist finally win in Mexico? The reasons, I would say, are exactly the same ones that Elena mentioned: corruption, security, and the economy. I think AMLO tapped into this sentiment that even though Mexico has had free and relatively fair elections since 2000, this hasn't translated into more effective political mechanisms, and also that corruption and insecurity pretty much feed themselves. And also that even though Mexico's liberal open economy has made it more competitive, at least by most of the rankings that you might see, it actually hasn't translated to a necessary level of GDP growth to solve the country's socioeconomic ills, and much less, trickle down and feed into the people who need that money most. So his rhetoric pretty much addresses this. His campaign logo was "Por el bien de todos, primero los pobres," for everyone's benefit, first the poor. And his mantra as president has been "No mentir, no robar, no traicionar al pueblo," which is no lying, no stealing, and no betrayal of the people. And also helping his cause was that the Peña Nieto administration saw a really severe deterioration, institutional deterioration. There was almost, a corruption scandal happening every other month. And if you look at the latest corruption rankings from Transparency International, Mexico is now the most corrupt among Latin America's 7 largest economies, aside from Venezuela, which is not a great statistic. So definitely AMLO is a populist, no doubt about it, as is Bolsonaro. They both use a very anti-establishment discourse. They both appeal to voters rather than elites. They both have nationalistic, nostalgic overtones, and they both kind of particularly yearn for this golden age in the 60s or 70s, which was actually a golden year for growth for both Mexico and Brazil during that time. Clearly, AMLO doesn't refer to any dictatorship or authoritarian aspects the way that Bolsonaro does, but he does also idealize that period. Now, as with Bolsonaro as well, AMLO is not really an anti-establishment candidate. He has the discourse, but he's very much an establishment politician. His entire political career has been among one of the major Mexican political parties, first the PRI, then the PRD. So I think it's better to see him not so much as an outsider, but sort of the rebellious brother within the Mexican political family. So why is this period idolized so much? As any good economist, I'm going to give you some numbers. GDP growth during a period known as the Desarrollo Estabilizador. This was a period of relative macro stability, roughly between the mid-1950s to 1970. GDP growth in this period was 6.9%. In the 21st century, it's been 2.1%. Now, if you look at it in terms of GDP per the growth in the working age population, which I think is the best indicator to see how much of this growth actually is coming into people's pockets, during that period it was 4.1. During the 21st century, it's been 0.1. So basically, for the majority of Mexicans, they haven't really seen this growth materialize. And even though Mexico has not had a recession in 10 years, which is actually a modern record, and certainly not a crisis like Brazil's. Brazil's crisis knocked off 8% of GDP from peak to trough. People have felt that the economy has stagnated. They feel the country has sort of not progressed the way that politicians have promised, either the promise of NAFTA back in the 90s or the promise of the structural reforms under Peña Nieto. And just to give you an example, the government's own budget forecast, which come out a few months before the actual budget is approved, in 1914, which was at the peak moment of the structural reform agenda, estimated that Mexico should have grown last year by 5.3%. And in reality, it just grew slightly more than 2%. After NAFTA, Mexico has been the fourth lowest in Latin America in terms of growth, just 1.2% on average. And FDI as a share of GDP is just 2.6% during this period, which actually is just slightly above half of Honduras, Jamaica, and Nicaragua, countries that none of you probably assume to be the most competitive and dynamic in the region. So from the economic side, you can see where the sentiment comes from. Now, as to what AMLO promises, I think if one has to describe him, is he's a left-wing economic nationalist. He's a social conservative, actually. And I would say if you can sum him up in one word, he's a statist. So he sees a role for the state back in economic activity in the way that hasn't happened in a long time. You know, you can see policies like having the army build a new airport in Santa Lucia, which is unprecedented. You know, in what country does the army actually build civilian infrastructure? He's also vowed to keep the army on the street and create a national guard. And although he hasn't rolled back all of the structural reforms that were passed under Peña Nieto, he's definitely halted them. But overall, and I think this was already mentioned, is his economic policies are not really that transformative. I would say that if you look at, for example, the Labour Party's agenda here in the UK, it's much more radical in terms of just how left it is than López Obrador, or even some elements of the Democratic Party in the US. Now, on the positive side, AMLO like Bolsonaro, has a really strong mandate in terms of popular opinion, but he also has a mandate in terms of actual control of Congress. He has a majority on both houses of the Congress, and he also controls more than half of the state legislatures in Mexico. And this is really important because you need to pass constitutional reforms only with the approval of more than half of the state legislatures. So he can pretty much, at least in his first 3 years in power, can do whatever he wants, practically rule by decree, even though that's in Mexico you don't have rule by decree as you do in other countries. He won't need to make alliances, and the opposition is completely delegitimized and disorganized, so it's going to take a while before they offer any substantial opposition. However, I still think that change will not be easy. First of all, Mexico's political problems are not due to a bad government or even two bad governments in a row. But just it goes to actually how the Mexican political establishment is, and it's a system that permits reforms only at the margins, and it very much favors the incumbent. So any incumbent government really would rather just stick with the system rather than change it. On the economic side as well, it has not much to do with just bad macro policies, but actually microeconomic dysfunctions that are very complicated and aren't resolved just by tweaking this or tweaking that, but really require an overhaul of the labor market, of the welfare system, of the tax regime. And these are areas that AMLO really hasn't touched upon yet. And in some cases, it doesn't seem like he will. I'll wrap up really quickly. He's trying to do a lot very quickly as well, and it's not quite sure whether the Mexican bureaucracy has the competence or technocracy has the competence to do this. But on the other hand, he has shown a willingness to tackle problems that other governments didn't address. And one of these cases, like the fuel theft crisis that hit Mexico in January, which I'll happily talk about in a follow-up question. But that's a good example of something that he's done that pretty much 3 administrations just didn't bother doing anything against. So I would say that AMLO, he seeks to transcend. He really, his administration is the fourth transformation or so. But his personalistic style of leadership can be problematic because it doesn't leave a lot of room to make the changes on the institutional front that Mexico really needs. So that's a bit concerning. And even though his mandate will allow him to will his policies into being, he can't will their outcome. So thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. I think one of the fascinating things that I pick out from this discussion, but also from observing what goes on in my country, in Mexico, and what goes on in Brazil, is that in the case of Mexico, AMLO has been running for president for 17 years. So he knows exactly what he wants. He knows exactly where he wants to go. He's been very transparent about it, I think very much like President Trump during his campaign. And he has a fairly direct way of looking at his objectives and dealing with them. He has a daily press conference, which lasts for anywhere between 1 hour to almost 2 hours every day at 7 in the morning, gets his cabinet people to come to this meeting. They're all bleary-eyed. They've had to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning to get there. And they all have to stand while he talks. Some of the members of cabinet are elderly. So it's really quite an interesting way but the communication is very effective, extremely effective. And the fact is that when AMLO was elected, he had pretty much the same popularity that Bolsonaro has, 70%. Today, his popularity is 87%. In spite of the fact that he's had to face 3 or 4 very complicated crises. The issue of the gasoline shortage, the closing of the airport, the downgrading of Pemex by one of the rating agencies, a whole series of things, and his popularity only grows because he is a master communicator with his base, and his base is fairly broad, as Rodrigo says. In the case of Bolsonaro, you have a guy who is very young. López Obrador is not young. Bolsonaro is relatively young, relatively unknown in the sense that he was not running for president for 17 years. So everything is yet to be discovered about him. And his first month and some of his time in office, he's had to spend in the hospital because he, as a result of the assassination attempt, he had a series of follow-up surgeries and things, and he's still in the hospital today. Maybe be out this week, but apparently he's still in that way. So 2 strong presidents, very, very strong, with very weak opposition, although in the case of Brazil, it's a very fractured opposition, while as in the case of Mexico, it's a diminished opposition, I'd say, without the possibility of really presenting a major obstacle to the president's desires and objectives. And finally, both of them very much on the anti-corruption, anti-violence, and anti-impunity strategy in terms of how they've approached their electorate. The big question, and this is something I posed to the panelists and as well as to the audience, is when will reality catch up with populist promises? Because both of them have promised enormous amounts of things which financially, but also politically and socially may be very difficult to accomplish. So with that, I'm going to throw it open to questions or comments. Please be very brief. Pose a question, don't give a speech, and then we will have the opportunity for the panelists to comment. So I'm ready. Let's go first to the back of the room. You must identify yourself. Please stand up. Identify yourself. and your affiliation.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam. I'm a journalist with CNBC in London. I was looking to understand a little bit from the panel the regional impact of the crisis in Venezuela, and both how you'd anticipate both Bolsonaro and AMLO to deal with that deepening crisis. Thank you.
Good. We'll take a few questions at a time, and then we'll ask the panelists to talk. One of you two, I saw a hand raised.
Hi, Melissa Esquivel, student at King's College London. In Mexico, many people compare AMLO to Maduro. I would like to know the relationship about it.
Okay.
Alina Rocha-Menocal from the Overseas Development Institute. I'm wondering, I think it was really interesting to hear about the kinds of support that both AMLO and Bolsonaro have, but my impression coming from Mexico myself is that let's say the powerful elites in Mexico are much less reluctant to embrace AMLO's project of reform, whereas Bolsonaro does have a lot more support from the economic and political powerful establishment. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rodrigo, do you want to talk about AMLO Maduro?
Sure.
And then perhaps mention the Venezuela issue in passing, and then I'll ask Elena to talk about the Venezuela foreign policy, Brazil foreign policy, and if Kristina wants to say something as well.
Yeah, I think, well, the comparison between AMLO and Maduro, aside from the fact that they both are from the left, I think it ends there. I think in terms of their style is completely different. In terms of their economic policies as well, Mexico's brand of leftism does not seem to intend to nationalize large parts of the economy, for example. And also Mexico is not a mono exporter, so also its reliance on one source of foreign exchange doesn't limit itself. And so the likelihood that Mexico would have a crisis the way that Venezuela is having is, I would say, near zero in that sense. Also, the other thing, and I think this also answers the follow-up question, is even though elites in Mexico have been quite skeptical of AMLO for a long time, I think in some areas they have warmed up at least slightly to him. At least compared to, for example, when he ran in 2006, when almost the entire business sector thought he was the devil. But if you look at the policies that AMLO, for example, the very fact that in his first year at least he has not proposed a tax reform and has vowed not to raise taxes at least for the first half of his term, I mean, compare that, for example, with what a lot of Democrats are asking for in the US, to have a 70% upper marginal income tax. I mean, these things aren't being proposed in Mexico. The fundamental structure of the Mexican economy does not appear to change. And if you look at the budget estimates for this year, it's it could have been any year during the Peña Nieto administration. And anyway, I'll talk about Venezuela, I guess, in a follow-up question. So.
Fine. Elena?
Well, on the Venezuela question, I think it opens a number of issues. What we've seen so far is that Bolsonaro has supported as part of the Lima Group declaration. So Brazil recognizes Guaido now as the president of Venezuela. But I think it's much more complicated than just that. The background to this is a year-long policy by the PT under Lula too, which in a way assisted Venezuela's regime to keep up. I mean, financially also, there were a lot of transactions between Brazil and Venezuela during the years of the PT, ranging from sales of beef to energy. There was a lot going on, which in many ways helped sustain that regime. One of the reasons that Bolsonaro is positioning himself clearly against the PT is because, having been elected as everything that is contrary to the PT, that is, apart from his basic convictions, this is also an expected foreign policy approach, that they would do exactly the opposite than what the PT is doing. However, on the other hand, Brazilian foreign policy has traditionally been very strongly anti-intervention, and so that brings him at a bit of a contrast with the United States, which, however, he wants to align himself with. So there's a lot of different vortexes here of what's happening. And I don't think we have a clear picture on Venezuela and Brazil at the moment, but we generally don't have a clear picture on Venezuela. So, but clearly, The issue of Venezuela also touches on something that Andrés mentioned, which is when are things going to get real? And I think they're getting real very, very quickly, because what we have in Venezuela right now, in fact, is less of a regional thing, but rather the United States and China being on very different sides of the story. And Brazil is really caught up in that, because on the one hand, we have a government that wants to follow the US on foreign policy and align itself with the US, but we have a very strong economic relationship with China right now. So I think we're going to see a lot happening there. There was a question on the Bolsonaro base and elitist versus non-elitist. I'll just pick it up really quickly. Indeed, if we look at how people voted in Brazil, the Northeast, which is the less prosperous part of Brazil, did not vote for Bolsonaro largely. So indeed, there is there a sort of economic stratification divide. However, and again to Andrés's question, when do things get real? The proposed pension reform in many ways would benefit these people, but would clash with the interests of several elites. So again, if he goes ahead with this, with the pension reform, we may see some kind of movement in terms of who supports what.
Thank you. Kristina.
I'll comment briefly on Venezuela, not least because Canning House had an event in the Houses of Parliament yesterday, which if anybody's interested in, they can pick up on live stream, where we were talking about exactly this. But coming back to Mexico and to Brazil and their respective positions, I mean, it's particularly interesting that they have landed on very different sides on this whole question. And Bolsonaro was very quick getting in behind, or rather being behind the movement of the Lima Group to be calling for Maduro to go. Mexico has been dragging its heels and finds itself in very odd company with Bolivia, Russia, China, Cuba, and Turkey. And isn't aligned with the region at all. So it's be interesting to see whether that actually comes together. I mean, at one stage, the Mexicans were aligned with Uruguayans in not calling with the rest of the world for elections to happen. Uruguay has now joined the EU, the US, and the Lima Group, and Mexico is still standing looking rather isolated, and as I say, in rather strange company at the moment. We'll see how that one goes.
I couldn't agree more. You're absolutely right. Please. Okay, the mic is over there, but okay. Please. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go.
Thank you. All right. Hilda Rapp, Center for International Peace Building. I also am interested in the reality question. I'm aware that, particularly in Mexico, but equally in Brazil, there are huge inequalities, regional inequalities in terms of performance, economic, political, otherwise. And also they both share the problem with drugs. And how to deal with that. And from what I saw, there was really such insufficient infrastructure to deal with convictions, with investigation, with prison availability for actually locking anybody up, with training prison guards. And I wonder whether there is any kind of practical initiative afoot to deal with those underlying issues that would make it more possible to meet the political aspirations both have. Thank you.
The gentleman just behind you, yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Steve Cooney from. Well, I'm a Chatham House member, but I was formerly at the Library of Congress, and one of my jobs, I worked quite a bit on the steel industry, and visited Brazil a number of times, and so my question is about the mud. The subject hasn't been raised yet. What's going to happen with respect to Vale? I mean, it's a huge company, largest iron ore exporter in the world. Brazil is the second largest steel industry in the Americas. And so the question I have is, they stopped producing iron ore in Minas. So what do you forecast happening with respect to the Bolsonaro response to the whole crisis in that industry?
Okay, thank you. Boy, a very peaceful audience today.
Hi, Munif Kalawoon from UCL. I wanted to ask about the stance on the sciences by Bolsonaro, especially climate change. So we know the evangelical base are very skeptical of climate change theory, same with the cousins in the US, and this is very important, especially in Brazil with the Amazon rainforest. What future do you forecast with this situation? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's go in inverse order this time.
Yeah,
Kristina, start off, and
fine.
I'm sure you have a lot to say.
I'll try to keep it limited. But actually, if I can pick up on the climate change point first, I think, and also the point in mining, I think Brumadinho has going to have an impact, absolutely, definitely. I was in Sao Paulo last week and was asking people what they thought the impact on Vale would be. And frankly, it's not seen as something that's going to crater the company, was what I was hearing. It's within the scope of the company to deal with. But nevertheless, obviously, from a reputation point of view and financially, they're going to take quite a hit, and they're going to have to alter the operations that they're working on. As far as Brazil's contribution or lack of it on the climate change side, it's interesting that if you look at Brazil's role internationally, that is one of the areas where they've been notable for taking an international role. The other has been, to a degree, peacekeeping. But nevertheless, what Bolsonaro has certainly been saying through his campaign is very much, pro-agribusiness, loosening environmental controls, particularly restrictions on mining and ranching and farming. As I say, Brumadinho may well roll that back to some degree. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. But he's also on the record, I think, as opposing foreign NGO agendas on the Amazon, for example. He wants more hydro, he wants more nuclear power in the area, and also notably withdrew Brazil from the offer to host the 2019 UN Climate Change Conference. So lots of things on the Brazil side where I think there's a major question mark over what will happen on the climate change side. But actually, to be fair, balancing up a little bit, looking at what is happening in Mexico, I think we're getting very mixed messages from AMLO as well. So, on the one hand, he's saying he wants to protect the environment, he wants to consult with indigenous communities, he respects the Paris Agreement, and he wants to promote renewable energy. But on the other side of it, he's also saying he's going to freeze energy prices for several years. He's going to boost crude output ideally by 40% and gas by 50% by 2024. And he's also going to build a new refinery in Tabasco to produce 400,000 barrels of refined crude per day. So, it'll be interesting to see which comes out ahead on that one. So they're both under the microscope, I would say, on this one at the moment.
And he's also, in the case of AMLO, has also said that Mexico should go back to using coal for energy production, and that Mexico should not do any fracking. So have also that same contradiction in terms of a very ambitious commitment in Paris, very, very ambitious, probably the most ambitious in Latin America in terms of reducing and working with climate change, and the contradictions.
I'm not going to even attempt to talk about drug problems because that's way outside my territory.
I think you had me covered on environment and on mining. I think if I can add anything, it's with my feeling is that the Bolsonaro government is kind of ambivalent about what message it needs to send to the international community on climate. I think both in Davos, but also in some negotiations on concluding the EU-Mercosur FTA, it's been clear that particularly the EU and several other big international actors are very persistent on standards on environmental issues. And I think that may be where the Bolsonaro government makes a sort of somersault, because if they're serious about trade and free trade, the majority of free trade agreements these days are large scale, particularly the EU one, agreements that are also including environmental clauses. So I think that may be an issue where trade and environment, trade may in a way facilitate a more consistent sort of environmental and climate approach to the previous one, which was, as you said, Brazil was really a leader in this area, and it would be good if it remained so. On the mining, again, I think you covered it. The hope is that this will perhaps serve as a reason, an argument to see a bit more regulation on mining. And for example, in Brumadinho, it was revealed that the cafeteria of the place was over a pit. Things like that should not be happening, particularly if Brazil is to attract big international investors. And I think perhaps we'll see if we're lucky some better regulation. Drugs is also not my area, but I mean, the Bolsonaro government so far, it's clear what they insist on is gun ownership, sort of giving people guns for self-defense, bringing out the military. I'm not scientifically, this has not been shown so far to be the best way to deal with crime and drugs, but this is the platform that Bolsonaro was voted on. So I think for at least the first months after his inauguration, this is what we'll be seeing.
Rodrigo?
Yeah, so I think that this goes back to the issue of sort of the reality check of when things might go downhill for AMLO. And one of the points that was mentioned was his incredible approval rating right now of 87%, despite a month of fuel shortages. And I was there during all of January, and you know, even in Mexico City, you would see queues of like 4 or 6 blocks outside of gas stations, which was unprecedented. And if you looked at the criticism from his opponents, you would think that Mexico in January was basically Mad Max Fury Road. And yet people gave him the benefit of the doubt, and people said, well, you know, this is a hardship that we'll happily endure on a temporary basis insofar as it addresses a real issue involving security. However, even though I do think that AMLO's kind of honeymoon period will definitely be longer than the average of a Latin American leader, I definitely don't think it's going to go down significantly in his first year. But there's the issue of growth. You know, if the economy doesn't start growing the way that he has promised, and he promised 4% growth by the end of his term, but if it doesn't start moving in that direction, then people are going to start becoming a bit more cynical. The other is the security element. I mean, people are really worried about this. There's been an uptick in crime and violence in the last 2-3 years of the Peña Nieto administration, and it doesn't seem to be abating right now. And I think a lot of even people who have supported López Obrador have really not looked too kindly on his security strategy, which basically involves more militarization of society rather than less, despite what a lot of civil society has actually demanded. And furthermore, there's not even the money to make any other alternative option. So for example, people have been calling for training local police forces, et cetera, but if there's no money, because the budget doesn't really allow much leeway in this respect, and Mexico only collects 13% of GDP in taxes, which is an absurdly low number, then there's not so much that you can do in terms of attacking the problem on all these fronts. The other thing that I think could really harm him is a corruption scandal. And if there's a corruption, I don't think it would involve him. You know, I do take his word that he is an honest politician and lives quite frugally himself, but it's not the same to say that about a lot of members of Morena. Especially because a lot of members of Morena aren't really committed to his ideology or his thriftness the way that he is. So I would say almost with 100% certainty that there will be a corruption scandal at some point over the next couple of years, and that, yes, it will involve someone in his inner circle and Morena. And the way that he deals with that scandal, I think, will be really a watershed moment in terms of, is he going to apply the same standard that he would, you know, or what he's been claiming that he would if it was from anyone else. Because the problem in Mexico has been the discretionary use of rule of law. Not that there isn't rule of law, it's just that it applies to who the president or the ruling party wants to. And AMLO really needs to break away from that mold if he wants to appear different.
I think if I might just pick up on that corruption point. I mean, if you take that to Bolsonaro, I mean, he's somebody who has got as far as we can know, at least, a clean background to date. I mean, there are loads of other things he's been accused of, you know, sexism, homophobia, and so on, but, you know, he's not been accused of corruption so far. But I think one of the credibility tests, similar to Mexico and AMLO, is, you know, how is he going to deal with the corruption allegations that are surfacing against his tourism minister, against one of his sons? You know, that will be an acid test as to whether his anti-corruption message is actually, I think, believed.
Yeah, and I think the same holds true for López Obrador, because already 2 of his cabinet members have been found out in terms of not having declared properties that they own in the United States. Every member of government in Mexico has to publicly declare what their assets are, and already 2 of his ministers, the Minister of the Interior and the Minister of Communications, have both been found out by the media, by the way, to have things that they did not declare. So I think it holds true for both. And the other issue is that I think at the top, Bolsonaro, López Obrador, are probably honest. They're probably clean. Because in the case of López Obrador, if he hadn't been clean, somebody would have found it out over this 17 years. And they certainly tried very hard, never found anything. But again, as Rodrigo says, people around him. And the cabinet that Elena mentioned in the case of Bolsonaro as bizarre is equally bizarre in Mexico. It's a cabinet made up of academics, of people that don't have government experience, people who don't have any, as we say in Spanish, cola que les pisen, that is, they don't have anything that somebody could find of their backgrounds where they might have been corrupt or might have done something wrong. But at the same time, they are not a unified group that would be able to fulfill a strategy that López Obrador might want them to do. And I believe, in my own perception, that this cabinet in Mexico is a transition cabinet and probably will be falling off as this year goes by and new people will be coming in that he wants to name. Question there in the very, very back.
John Curtis, House Comms Library. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about AMLO's approach to migration, especially from his own southern border. I know there's been some attempts to secure that. How will he change what's happened before? Will he be uncomfortable with being seen to support a sort of Trump strategy of stopping migration?
Very good.
Hello, Orlando Edwards, British Council. I think in the lead up to the election, Bolsonaro talked about, one of his commitments was about abolishing the Ministry of Culture and cutting state funding for the arts. And similarly, he talked about cleansing universities of left-wing teachers and installing right-wing vice-chancellors. I just wondered if the panel could share some insights on that, and perhaps if there was anything, I'm not sure what AMLO, if in the similar vein he made any pledges. And then secondly, there's been a lot of talk in this country about sort of global Britain going out there and forging new partnerships. What do you think of the prospects of AMLO and Bolsonaro looking to the UK for forging their new partnerships?
Good question. Jeremy.
Jeremy Greenstock, Gatehouse Advisory. On the back of that, could you say a little bit more about the foreign policy field? There used to be a Brazil-South Africa-India connection, the relationship with the United States, the attitudes in at the UN. Brazil is well known for its outward reach and its wish to cooperate with other countries on global issues. Is that going to fade under Bolsonaro? And perhaps a comment on the AMLO front on foreign policy as well would be good.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's very important. And I'd add another question to the panelists relating to the rapprochement between Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance, which began under the Temer government and the former government of Mexico in Peña Nieto. Is that likely to continue, or is Mercosur dead forever? Or what's going to happen? Because I think that's very important. Elena, why don't you lead off as the Brazilian in the room?
Yeah, honorary. Well, Macri and Bolsonaro decided there will be no obituary for Mercosur yet. In fact, they met in January and they decided, actually on the back of what Temer and Macri had also discussed, that Mercosur is not dead, but that it needs to change. I think what Bolsonaro is envisioning is perhaps a little more flexibility in terms of the leeway to sign FTAs. I think it's been a real long-standing realization that Mercosur is not very flexible and efficient in doing that. So I think they're in the process of seeing how they can restore a Mercosur that is more flexible, more dynamic, and actually make it work for what it was supposed to be from the beginning, a sort of customs union which enhances trade within the area, but also is more of a vehicle for trade within the area rather than to stop or to inhibit and make it more difficult to sign FTAs outside the area. Wider foreign policy is a very broad issue. I mean, Brazil has traditionally been a supporter of the multilateral system of international law. It's been a supporter of non-interference in international affairs. It has had long-standing objectives in foreign affairs, including a seat in the UN Security Council with the G4. It's been, in recent years, very much part of this idea of having several multilateral, minilateral formations for the purposes of reforming global governance, such as the BRICS, IPSA, etc. So that's what you're referring to. We're seeing a bit of a departure from that right now. We're seeing a foreign minister who is very intent on a more moralistic approach to foreign affairs, if you would like, making Brazil part of a sort of, at least in discourse, Western sort of Christian group of states. We see that very much in the rapprochement with the US, and I say rapprochement because it's been a tricky relationship, and the fact that, Pompeo has been to Brazil, Bolton has been to Brazil, Araújo was in Washington last week. We'll probably have a visit by Bolsonaro. So all of this is actually a lot of activism in US-Brazil relations, and there's been suggestions of things that may not happen, but were clearly suggested in order to improve the relationships, such as a US military base in Brazil, which is probably not going to happen, but still the fact that it was mentioned. And we see, of course, a lot of alignment with Trump on a number of issues, discussing moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, discussing leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. So I think US is definitely on the list. But of course, this begs the question, how will relations with China fare? Because of course, Araújo's approach China is not in this group of states. But on the other hand, we have the trade relationship, we have investment. So that's going to be a big battle. I want to stop here because there's more I could say, but foreign policy is huge.
All right. Thank you. Rodrigo, you want to address the migration issue with the Central American Caravans and the relationship with the U.S. on the issue?
Yeah, overall, I think he's trying to juggle the fact that he doesn't want to antagonize Trump too much, but at the same time, he seems to be quite unfazed by anything that Trump says about Mexicans or migrants in general. So I think that's he's not going to be personally insulted by Trump in any dimension. And his government has actually given support to the big caravan that was there in the last month. And I think that would be a good thing in order, his government seems to be a bit more sympathetic to the human rights abuses that these people suffer, because Mexico has traditionally had a very, very, I would say, shameful double standard of the way that how we treat Central American migrants in Mexico and the way that we expect the U.S. to treat Mexican migrants in the U.S. But on the other hand, you can't just have a migrant caravan every month. So something needs to be, something needs to give in there. Someone mentioned also the thing about the universities, which even though it's not an issue in Mexico, I would say directly, it does, in a sense, touch upon AMLO's inherent combativeness with the media, for example, and with things that he doesn't view as kind of having his pure background of struggle and opposing the system. And so, for example, he's had a beef with one of Mexico's big private universities, the ITAM, which he sees as kind of being an old boys network. But whether, a sort of intellectual cleansing the way that Bolsonaro has suggested, which hopefully he won't do, but I don't think that's a threat in Mexico. And I just want to say a couple of things on the foreign policy side, because I haven't really touched upon that. Mexico's foreign relationships are dominated by the U.S. I mean, the relationship with Latin America is non-existent on a political level, in any practical sense. So I don't think Mexico has any influence, for example, on the Venezuelan crisis. But at the same time, the economic reality as well is that, this is a country that has 80% of its exports to the U.S. So any regional economic activity or any regional integration that Mexico has supported over the last couple of years, or the Pacific Alliance, for example, has to deal with that reality that Mexico only trades, maybe 3% or 4% of its entire export stock with the countries in the Pacific Alliance. So ultimately, its influence is going to be quite modest in this regard. So I don't really see him as very much a pan-Americanist in any sense. It's actually telling that probably his most high-profile minister, which is Marcelo Ebrard, has largely been on the sidelines in these his first 2 months, which is quite strange. And I've been talking to people who suspect that he just kind of wants to ride out any early-term controversies and then maybe find a more visible position later on. But then on the other side, even this hands-off approach could at least, you know, in the Venezuela case, I think it's hurting him more than helping. But on the other hand, he's probably going to not resort on some of the needless provocations that you had, for example, during the Vicente Fox years, where he made a lot of enemies for no reason whatsoever. But I don't really think that Mexico has much to contribute in terms of regional integration.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo. Kristina?
Given time, I will
go ahead. You have time.
Quickly.
But would you address the question about the relationship with the UK? Because
Absolutely.
I think that's very important.
I'll gladly include that.
As we're in the UK, we have to talk about it.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me start with just a reflection on where, you know, things like the almost unpronounceable CPTPP, the Pacific Alliance reworked, and Mercosur is sitting. The fact that Mexico has got now the US-Mexico-Canada FTA in process, albeit not ratified yet, the fact that they are already part of CPTPP, I think actually puts them in a rather better position than Brazil in terms of, you know, they're in the swim of some free trade agreements that are actually seem to be going somewhere. Frankly, my own view on Mercosur is we're still on slow track, you know, still haven't got it signed off with the EU. That's fairly typical of what's going on there. So although it may refocus, I'm still not sure it's actually going to really accelerate. That actually reflects on, you know, what the UK can do in terms of, you know, trading alliances, what it might roll over from the EU, and so on and so forth. So I think that plays very much into that space. So I think Mexico is in a more dynamic area than Brazil is in that regard. That said, bilaterally, in the sense that I have from my position is that both are very much open for business if Britain wants to be genuinely global. So I think that is to play for. If I step back to look at how Mexico is working and how Brazil is working. Mexico on the trade side, I think, can make good progress because of those alliances, as I say, but politically, I go back to Venezuela, it's somewhat out of step with the rest of the region. Also, the fact that for migration purposes, you know, they're very much, their foreign policy looks north. The only reason why they're looking south, really, I think, at all, is because of the Central American Caravans at the moment. So, you know, Mexico, for me, places itself very much in the North American continent, if you will. Brazil, on the other hand, I still see Brazil, despite the focus on domestic policy, playing a considerable role in peacekeeping still, less on the environmental side. But to be perfectly honest, unless Brazil can simplify its political system such that it doesn't have the fragmentation with the parties and it can actually build some stable coalitions, I do think it's going to really remain the gentle giant within the area, tripping over its shoelaces from time to time because they've been tied together by a political system that doesn't really free it to do what it ought to be doing.
Well, with that, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists. I think the subject matter is worthy, perhaps, of a continuation at some point in the near future, because there are many things we did not cover because of time constraints. But thank you very much for your patience and for your attendance.